The notification arrived at exactly 11:47 a.m., slicing through my morning coffee ritual like a blade through silk. 3 sentences. No warmth, no hesitation. Just brutal finality carved into pixels on my phone screen. Don't bother coming to the estate meeting tomorrow. You made your choice 5 years ago. Security has your photo. Try anything and you'll be removed. Marcus Blackwood. My half-brother, 3 years my junior, but somehow appointed guardian of the family legacy, keeper of the Blackwood name, and apparently chief executioner of inconvenient relatives. His messages always carried that same corporate coldness, as if he'd learned to communicate exclusively through quarterly reports and legal briefs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, as if staring longer might reveal some hidden compassion beneath the cruelty. It never came. My phone buzzed again, this time with a longer message from Catherine, my stepmother, her words wrapped in that familiar silk-covered poison she'd perfected over the years. Sarah, please try to understand. Tomorrow's meeting will determine the future of Blackwood Holdings. Your grandfather's will is complicated enough without creating unnecessary drama. Don't make this harder than it has to be for your father. Please try to understand. As if I hadn't spent a decade trying, as if understanding had ever been mutual in the Blackwood household. I set the phone down slowly, deliberately, next to a small pewter paperweight shaped like a sailing ship, my mother's. She'd given it to me the day I left for Wharton, back when dreams still felt possible and the Blackwood name still felt like home. On the bottom, barely visible after years of handling, were the words she had had engraved in elegant script. Chart your own course. Robert Blackwood, my father, hadn't spoken to me directly in 5 years. Not since the day he called my interest in international finance gambling with family reputation. Not since he declared my plans for offshore investment management a betrayal of everything this family has built. Tomorrow he would turn 75, and apparently there was no room at his table for the daughter who'd stopped being useful, stopped being manageable, stopped being the heir he could mold in his image. The irony sat bitter on my tongue as I glanced across my office at the wall where my credentials hung in understated frames. Wharton MBA, magna cum laude, CFA certification, and, tucked discreetly in the corner, a small plaque from Financial Times naming me one of the top 40 under 40 in wealth management. They didn't know. None of them knew what Sarah Mitchell had built from the ashes of Sarah Blackwood's exile. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan office, casting long shadows across polished marble floors. 53 floors below, the city hummed with the energy of people building empires, destroying them, rebuilding them again. Up here, in this sanctuary I'd carved from ambition and spite, the only sound was the gentle tick of an antique clock and the whisper of my own breathing. What does it mean when your family treats your absence like a gift and your presence like a threat? What does it mean when the people who raised you would rather pretend you never existed than admit they might have been wrong? I already knew my answer, had known it for months as this day approached. The paperweight caught the light, its tiny ship seeming to move on invisible waves, and I smiled for the first time that morning. 5 years. That's how long it had been since I walked out of the Blackwood Holdings Tower in Greenwich, carrying nothing but a leather briefcase and the weight of my mother's dying words echoing in my mind. Don't let them make you small, Sarah. You're worth more than their approval. The conversation replayed in my memory with crystalline clarity, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was delivered with the kind of quiet devastation that cuts deeper than screaming ever could.
Offshore investments are for tax dodgers and criminals, my father had said, not even looking up from the architectural plans spread across his mahogany desk. We build things, Sarah. Real things. Buildings people can see, touch, live in. We don't shuffle money around in shadow accounts like some kind of financial pirate. I was 28 then, fresh from a summer internship at Goldman Sachs, where I'd learned that the real money, the transformational wealth, lived in the spaces between countries, in the careful navigation of international markets that most people never even knew existed. My thesis on cryptocurrency integration and offshore portfolio management caught the attention of three major investment firms. But in that room, surrounded by blueprints and construction photos, I felt like a child presenting crayon drawings to adults. Catherine had stood beside him, arms crossed, her face a mask of practiced concern. This family has built something solid, something lasting. Your grandfather didn't claw his way out of poverty by chasing fantasies, Sarah. He bought land, developed it, created value people could see and understand. That was the last conversation I ever had in that office. They offered me a position, of course, vice president of acquisitions, corner office overlooking the Sound, company car, expense account, and the promise of inheriting a piece of something I'd never wanted to build. I declined politely, professionally, then walked out into the Connecticut afternoon and never looked back. Mitchell Capital Management began in a shared office space in Soho, just me, a laptop, and an unshakable belief that the future of wealth lived in the digital realm, in cryptocurrency, in the borderless world of international finance that most people never even knew existed. Those first months were brutal. Ramen noodles for dinner, sleeping on David Chen's couch when I couldn't make rent, cold calling potential clients who hung up the moment I mentioned offshore accounts. People think building a financial empire is glamorous, all power lunches and corner offices. It's not. It's 18-hour days staring at market fluctuations, learning Mandarin so you can speak directly to Hong Kong investors, studying the tax codes of 17 different countries until you dream in legal clauses. It's the kind of loneliness that comes from being the only person who believes in your vision, the only one willing to bet everything on being right. But I was right. By year 2, Mitchell Capital was managing portfolios for tech entrepreneurs looking to diversify internationally. By year 3, we'd secured our first 9-figure client. By year 4, I was flying to Switzerland monthly, maintaining relationships with private banks that most Americans had never heard of.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Never heard of. And now, 5 years later, we manage over $12 billion in assets across 14 countries, specializing in the kind of sophisticated offshore strategies that made traditional wealth management look like a children's game. Marcus had removed me from every family communication within a month of my departure. No dramatic announcement, no explanation, just gone from holiday cards, birthday celebrations, the annual Blackwood Holdings newsletter that celebrated another year of steady, unimaginative growth. I might as well have died for all the acknowledgement I received. He was protecting his inheritance, of course, clearing the path for his eventual ascension to the throne of mediocrity our father had built, but I wasn't angry about it anymore. Anger required caring, and I'd found something better than their approval. I'd found my own success, my own identity, my own empire built on everything they'd told me was impossible. It's strange how completely a family can erase you from their story. Stranger still how liberating it becomes when you realize you don't need to be part of their narrative to write your own. The call came at 6:30 p.m. while I was standing in my apartment kitchen, watching the sunset paint Manhattan gold through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The view stretched from Central Park to the Hudson River, a panorama of ambition made manifest in steel and glass. "Everything's confirmed for tomorrow," David Chen said, his voice carrying that particular mix of excitement and apprehension that marked the biggest moments in our partnership. "Victoria Sterling's people have verified the transfer authorizations. She specifically requested that you be present for the announcement." I turned from the window, letting the golden light fade to the cooler blues of evening.
And you're certain Robert doesn't know? David's laugh was dry, knowing. Sarah, your father thinks offshore investments are what pirates do with treasure chests. He has no idea that the woman he's been courting for 6 months to save his company is the same Victoria Sterling who's been asking about you for 2 years. Victoria Sterling wasn't just another wealthy client. She was the client, the kind of investor whose name made Fortune 500 CEOs return calls personally and financial journalists sharpen their pencils. Her firm, Sterling Financial Group, managed the private wealth of technology billionaires, oil dynasty heirs, and at least 3 members of European royalty. She was also, as it happened, extremely interested in the offshore investment strategies that Mitchell Capital had pioneered, particularly our cryptocurrency integration protocols and our network of Cayman Islands partnerships. What made tomorrow's estate meeting particularly delicious was that Robert Blackwood had no idea he'd been courting his own daughter's business partner. To him, Victoria Sterling was simply the investment angel who might save Blackwood Holdings from the slow death of irrelevance that had been consuming the company for the past 3 years. Real estate development in Connecticut wasn't what it used to be, and traditional firms like his were discovering that the world had moved beyond their understanding while they weren't paying attention. She wants you to make the announcement personally, full disclosure about Mitchell Capital's involvement, the offshore restructuring proposal, everything. She thinks it's time the family knew exactly who they've been dealing with. I smiled, an expression I felt more than saw in the darkened reflection of the window. And the funds? Already transferred to the presentation account, $12.8 billion, just as promised. The documentation is ironclad, Sarah. When you open those account statements tomorrow, there won't be any doubt about what you've built. I ended the call and stood in the gathering darkness thinking about the girl who'd left Greenwich 5 years ago with nothing but wounded pride and a mother's blessing. Tomorrow, that girl would walk back into the world that had rejected her, not as the prodigal daughter begging forgiveness, but as the architect of her family's only hope for survival. The irony was perfect. They'd spent 5 years pretending I didn't exist, and now their future depended entirely on everything they'd dismissed as impossible. Tomorrow, Robert Blackwood would learn that his criminal daughter had built exactly the kind of empire he'd always claimed was fantasy. Tomorrow, he would discover that the financial strategies he'd mocked were the only thing standing between his legacy and complete collapse. I dressed carefully the next morning, choosing a charcoal gray suit with clean lines, Italian leather shoes, and the sailing ship paperweight clipped to my briefcase as a reminder of where this journey had begun. No jewelry except my mother's simple pearl earrings, no makeup beyond what was necessary to look professional rather than vengeful. I wasn't going to the estate needing to make a scene or settle old scores. I was going to save a company that was too proud to ask for help and too stubborn to admit they needed exactly what they'd rejected 5 years ago. The drive from Manhattan to Greenwich took exactly 97 minutes in Saturday morning traffic. 97 minutes to rehearse the words I'd never thought I'd have the opportunity to say. The autumn leaves were turning gold and crimson along the Merritt Parkway, the same route I'd driven in the opposite direction all those years ago, young and heartbroken, and convinced that leaving meant losing everything that mattered. Now I knew better. Sometimes leaving is the only way to discover what you're actually worth. The Blackwood estate hadn't changed, still sprawling across 12 acres of manicured perfection like something from a magazine about people who had too much money and too little imagination. The circular driveway curved past fountain sculptures and rose gardens maintained by a staff I'd never been allowed to know personally. Georgian colonial architecture, brick and white columns, the kind of house that whispered old money and older prejudices to anyone who bothered to listening. I parked between a Mercedes and a Bentley, both black, both sparkling with the kind of cleanliness that came from never being driven anywhere interesting. Through the tall windows of the main house, I could see figures moving about in the library where these family meetings always took place. Marcus would be there, playing host and heir apparent. Catherine would be orchestrating refreshments and managing conversations like a conductor directing an orchestra of social anxiety. And Robert, my father, would be holding court at the head of the antique conference table, surrounded by lawyers and financial advisors and the accumulated weight of a legacy he no longer knew how to protect. I checked my watch. Victoria Sterling would arrive in exactly
15 minutes, followed by her team of lawyers and the documentation that would change everything. I had 15 minutes to walk into that room as Sarah Blackwood, the family disappointment, before revealing myself as Sarah Mitchell, the woman who held their future in her hands. The front door opened before I could knock. revealing Marcus in a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His face cycled through surprise, confusion, and anger in the space of a heartbeat, before settling on cold dismissal. "I told you not to come," he said, already reaching for his phone. "Security is on speed dial, Sarah. Don't make this ugly." "I'm not here as family," I replied calmly, producing a business card from my jacket pocket. "I'm here representing Mitchell Capital Management. Your father scheduled this meeting, Marcus. I'm simply honoring his appointment." He stared at the card like it might burst into flames. "Mitchell Capital? I've never heard of—" "Perhaps you should have done more research before courting Victoria Sterling's investment," I said, stepping past him into the marble foyer where my mother's portrait still hung above the side table, watching over a home that had forgotten her daughter. "She specifically requested that I attend today's meeting. I assume you won't keep her waiting." The library fell silent when I entered, conversations dying mid-sentence as 15 pairs of eyes turned toward the doorway. Robert sat at the head of the mahogany table, papers spread before him like battle plans, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his tie noted with the precision of a man who'd never learned to dress casually. To his right, Catherine perched on the edge of her chair, emerald silk and nervous energy. Around the table, lawyers and advisors and family board members who'd never bothered learning my name. "Sarah," Robert said finally, his voice carrying the weight of 5 years' silence. "You shouldn't be here." "No," I agreed, taking the empty chair at the far end of the table. "But Mitchell Capital should be, and I am Mitchell Capital." The confusion was immediate. Whispered questions and exchanged glances as people tried to process information that didn't fit their understanding of the world. Catherine's face had gone pale, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping her water glass like an anchor. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, still holding my business card like evidence of some elaborate practical joke. "Ladies and gentlemen," came a voice from behind Marcus, clear and commanding and unmistakably authoritative. Victoria Sterling stepped into the room, followed by 2 assistants carrying leather portfolios and the kind of quiet confidence that came from never having to introduce yourself. I apologize for the delay. Traffic from the city was more complicated than anticipated. She was exactly as I remembered from our private meetings, silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, charcoal suit tailored to perfection, and pale blue eyes that missed nothing. At 62, Victoria Sterling had spent 4 decades building an investment empire that made other billionaires nervous, and she moved through the world like someone who'd never doubted her right to be anywhere she chose to stand. "Miss Sterling," Robert said finally, rising from his chair with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that came from knowing your survival depended on making a good impression. "Welcome to our home. I trust you've reviewed our proposal for—" "I have," Victoria interrupted gently, taking the chair that had been prepared for her at Robert's right hand. "And I'm afraid there's been something of a misunderstanding about today's meeting. You see, Robert, the investment opportunity we've been discussing isn't exactly what you think it is." She nodded to her assistant, who began placing documents around the table with mechanical precision. "For the past 6 months, you've been courting Sterling Financial Group to invest in Blackwood Holdings. What you didn't realize is that we've been evaluating whether your company is worth acquiring as a subsidiary of our existing offshore investment portfolio." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that preceded earthquakes and revelations and the collapse of everything people thought they understood about their lives. "I don't understand," Robert said slowly. Victoria smiled, the expression carrying both warmth and steel. "Perhaps Miss Mitchell can explain. After all, this was her idea." Every head turned toward me, 15 pairs of eyes suddenly desperate to understand who I was and how I'd gotten here, and what authority I could possibly have in a room full of lawyers and money and power. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 5 years' preparation settling on my shoulders like armor. "For the past 18 months, I began, my voice carrying easily through the library's perfect acoustics. Mitchell Capital Management has been conducting due diligence on Blackwood Holdings at Miss Sterling's request. Our analysis indicates that this company is approximately 8 months from bankruptcy,
hemorrhaging money on outdated development strategies and bleeding market share to firms that understand modern real estate investment. Catherine's water glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a crystalline explosion that no one moved to clean up. However, our analysis also indicates that with proper restructuring, offshore investment strategies, and integration with international cryptocurrency markets, Blackwood Holdings could be transformed into a profitable subsidiary of Sterling Financial Group within 2 years. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "You can't just walk into our family meeting and start making pronouncements about our company's future." I smiled then, the first genuine expression of joy I'd felt in this house since my mother's funeral. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, founder and managing director of Mitchell Capital Management. We currently oversee $12.8 billion in offshore investments across 14 countries, specializing in cryptocurrency integration and international tax optimization strategies." The number hit the room like a physical blow. Someone gasped. Someone else swore under their breath. Robert gripped the edge of the table hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "That's not possible." "I'm also," I added, my voice soft now, intimate, carrying the weight of 5 years' exile and the satisfaction of vindication finally achieved. "I'm Sarah Blackwood, your daughter, the one you told was wasting her life on criminal fantasies." The silence stretched like a taut wire, threatening to snap under the weight of revelation. Robert's face had drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing without sound like a man drowning in air. Catherine remained frozen, emerald silk and shattered expectations, while Marcus swayed slightly as if the floor beneath his feet had shifted.
Suddenly become unsteady. Victoria Sterling watched the family's disintegration with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating chemical reaction. Her pale blue eyes moved from face to face, cataloging shock, denial, and the slow creep of understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. $12.8 billion? Robert finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio, placing it on the polished mahogany table with deliberate care. The sound echoed through the library like a judge's gavel announcing verdict. These are the current holding statements for Mitchell Capital Management's primary offshore accounts: Cayman Islands, Swiss private banking, Singapore digital asset portfolios, and Luxembourg cryptocurrency trusts. My fingers moved across the documents with practiced efficiency, selecting specific pages and sliding them toward my father. This page shows our Bitcoin mining operations in Iceland, generating approximately $4 million per month in passive income. This one details our partnership with 3 Swiss private banks, managing inherited wealth for technology entrepreneurs who prefer their assets untraceable by traditional means. Robert picked up the first document with trembling hands, his eyes scanning figures that must have seemed impossible. Behind him, Catherine leaned forward, reading over his shoulder, her perfectly composed mask finally cracking to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. "The Shanghai real estate portfolio alone," I continued, enjoying the methodical destruction of their assumptions, "generates more quarterly profit than Blackwood Holdings has managed in the past 3 years combined. We've revolutionized how international wealth moves between countries, how digital assets integrate with traditional investments, and how sophisticated clients protect their fortunes from government oversight." Marcus stumbled to his chair, finally finding his voice. "But you left. You walked away from everything. You had nothing." "I had everything that mattered," I replied, pulling out another set of documents. "I had vision, education, and most importantly, I had the willingness to build something new instead of clinging to something dying. While you were learning to manage grandfather's outdated real estate empire, I was creating the kind of investment strategies that your clients are already moving toward, whether you understand it or not." The portfolio contained photographs now, images of our offices in Manhattan, Hong Kong, and Zurich.
Pictures of meetings with heads of sovereign wealth funds, handshake agreements with cryptocurrency exchange founders, award ceremonies where financial magazines had recognized Mitchell Capital as one of the most innovative investment firms in the world. "This is our Hong Kong office," I said, sliding a photo across the table. "43rd floor of the International Finance Center. We employ 67 people across 7 countries, all of them specialists in offshore investment strategies that traditional firms like yours can't even comprehend, let alone compete with." Robert set down the documents and looked directly at me for the first time since I'd revealed my identity. His eyes held something I'd never seen there before, something that might have been respect fighting a losing battle against wounded pride. "Why?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell us? Why let us think you'd failed?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with 5 years of unasked questions and unspoken regrets. I could have answered with anger, could have reminded him of every dismissive comment, every conversation where my dreams had been reduced to childish fantasies. Instead, I chose truth. Because you never asked. In 5 years, not one of you ever wondered what happened to the girl who walked out of here with a Wharton MBA and enough ambition to power a small country. You deleted me from family communications, removed my pictures from holiday cards, and apparently convinced yourselves that I'd simply disappeared into failure and irrelevance. Catherine finally found her voice, though it emerged cracked and uncertain. "We thought you were angry. We thought you'd come back when you realized..." "Realized what? That I needed your approval to succeed? That I couldn't build anything meaningful without the Blackwood name opening doors for me?" I shook my head, feeling something between pity and satisfaction. "I didn't need you to believe in me, Catherine. I just needed you to stop actively discouraging me from becoming who I was meant to be." Victoria Sterling cleared her throat gently, reminding the room that this was ultimately a business meeting, not a family therapy session. "Perhaps we should discuss the specifics of the acquisition proposal. Miss Mitchell's personal history with your family is fascinating, but Sterling Financial Group is primarily interested in whether Blackwood Holdings can be salvaged as a profitable enterprise." She gestured to her assistant, who began distributing a new set of documents around the table. These were different from my portfolio, sleeker and more formal, bearing the Sterling Financial Group logo and the kind of legal language that transformed lives with the stroke of a pen. "Our analysis indicates that Blackwood Holdings possesses 3 valuable assets," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency of a surgeon explaining a necessary procedure. "First, your Connecticut land holdings, particularly the waterfront properties, represent approximately $200 million in development potential if properly leveraged. Second, your established relationships with local government and zoning boards provide access that newer firms cannot easily replicate. Third, your family name still carries weight in certain circles, though that influence is diminishing rapidly." Robert listened with the intensity of a man hearing his own eulogy, understanding for the first time that his legacy hung in the balance of decisions being made by people who had moved far beyond his ability to control or influence. "However," Victoria's voice sharpened, "your company is structured like a 1980s real estate firm trying to compete in a market that has evolved beyond your understanding. You're bleeding money on projects that should be profitable, losing opportunities that more agile firms are seizing, and generally operating as if the global economy hadn't fundamentally transformed over the past decade." She paused, allowing the assessment to settle like dust over a demolition site. "Sterling Financial Group is prepared to acquire controlling interest in Blackwood Holdings, restructure the company's operations according to modern investment strategies, principles, and integrate your local assets into our broader offshore portfolio. Ms. Mitchell will oversee this transition personally, given her unique understanding of both your family dynamics and the international strategies necessary for success." Marcus leaned forward, desperation finally overcoming pride. "What would that mean for us? For the family?" "It means survival," I answered before Victoria could respond. "It means transforming a failing Connecticut real estate company into a subsidiary of one of the world's most sophisticated investment firms. It means access to capital, international markets, and strategies that you've spent 5 years dismissing as impossible.
I pulled out the final document from my briefcase, a single page with 2 signature lines and enough legal authority to reshape everything the Blackwood name had ever represented. It also means acknowledging that the daughter you exiled for pursuing criminal fantasies is now the only person with both the ability and the willingness to save what grandfather built. The library fell silent again, but this time the quiet carried weight instead of shock. This was the silence of people realizing that their assumptions about the world had been fundamentally wrong, that the future they'd imagined was already impossible, and that salvation was being offered by the person they'd hurt most deeply. Robert reached for the document with hands that shook slightly, age and stress and the accumulated weight of 5 years' worth of poor decisions finally taking their toll. He read slowly, carefully, his lips moving slightly as he processed language that would transfer control of his life's work to the daughter he'd driven away. 51% controlling interest, he read aloud. Complete authority over restructuring and strategic direction. Integration with offshore investment portfolios and cryptocurrency markets. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw vulnerability in his eyes instead of judgment. You're asking me to hand over everything. I'm offering to save everything, I corrected. There's a difference between losing control and preventing total collapse. Without this acquisition, Blackwood Holdings will be bankrupt within 8 months. Your grandfather's legacy will become a cautionary tale about families who couldn't adapt to changing markets. Your name will be remembered as a footnote in Connecticut real estate history. I leaned forward, finally allowing some of the passion I'd buried for 5 years to surface in my voice. But with Sterling Financial Group's backing and Mitchell Capital's strategies, Blackwood Holdings becomes something grandfather never imagined possible. International reach, digital asset integration, sophisticated offshore tax optimization, and profits that make your current operations look like a children's lemonade stand. Catherine spoke suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like broken glass. And what about us? What about the family? Do we just become employees in our own company? The question revealed everything about how little they understood what was being offered. I smiled, not with cruelty, but with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a confused child. Catherine, you're thinking about this backwards. You wouldn't become employees in your own company. You'd become beneficiaries of an investment strategy that generates more wealth in a year than Blackwood Holdings has managed in its entire history. The family doesn't disappear. It gets elevated to a level of financial sophistication that you've never experienced. I gestured toward the portfolio of offshore account statements still spread across the table. These numbers represent what happens when you stop thinking locally and start thinking globally. When you stop seeing money as something that stays in Connecticut banks and start understanding how international finance actually works. Your grandfather built something impressive for his time, but his time is over. This is about building something impressive for the future. Catherine Sterling nodded approvingly, clearly satisfied with my explanation. The transition would be gradual, she added, her voice carrying the reassurance of someone who'd guided dozens of families through similar transformations. Existing management would remain in place during the restructuring phase, learning new methodologies and adapting to expanded market strategies. This isn't a hostile takeover. It's a rescue operation designed to preserve both your legacy and your financial future. Marcus finally spoke, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Sarah, I need to understand something. When you left here 5 years ago, when you walked out after that fight with Dad, did you already know this would happen? Did you already have some kind of plan? The question surprised me with its directness, its apparent genuine desire to understand, rather than simply argue or deflect. I considered my answer carefully, knowing that honesty might be more devastating than any revenge I could have plotted. No, I said finally. When I left here, I was heartbroken and angry and convinced that I'd lost everything that mattered. I didn't have a plan beyond proving that offshore investment strategies could work. I certainly didn't imagine that 5 years later I'd be sitting in this room offering to save the company that had rejected everything I represented. I paused, looking around the table at faces that were finally, truly listening to me for the first time in my adult life. But I also didn't imagine that you would spend 5 years pretending I didn't exist. I thought someone might call, might ask how I was doing, might show even minimal curiosity about whether I'd succeeded or failed. The plan to acquire Blackwood Holdings only emerged when Victoria Sterling started asking questions about Connecticut real estate opportunities, and I realized that my family's company was exactly the kind of underperforming asset that her firm specialized in transforming. Robert set down the acquisition document and rubbed his temples, looking every one of his 75 years for the first time since I'd known him. So this is coincidence? We're facing bankruptcy and you just happen to be in a position to save us? This is consequence, I corrected. You rejected modern investment strategies, so your company stagnated while markets evolved around you. You dismissed cryptocurrency and offshore portfolios as criminal enterprises, so you missed the most significant wealth-building opportunities of the past decade. You deleted your daughter from family communication, so you had no idea that she was building exactly the kind of business empire that could have saved you years ago. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a controlled burn, clearing away years of accumulated misunderstanding and revealing the landscape beneath. This wasn't a fairy tale about vindication or revenge. This was a business proposition delivered by someone who happened to share their last name and their genetic code, but had long since stopped needing their approval or affection. The offer stands for 24 hours, Victoria Sterling announced, checking her watch with the precision of someone whose time was literally worth millions. After that, Sterling Financial Group will pursue other acquisition opportunities, and Blackwood Holdings will continue its current trajectory toward insolvency. She gathered her papers with efficient movements, preparing to leave now that the essential information had been delivered. Ms. Mitchell will remain available to answer any technical questions about the restructuring process or the offshore investment strategies that would be implemented. I suggest you use the time wisely.
Blade through silk. David Chen's voice carried an urgency that made me sit up straighter in my kitchen chair, coffee forgotten in my hands. Sarah, we have a problem. 3 of our Cayman accounts were accessed overnight by someone using administrator credentials. The security logs show movement of approximately $800 million. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, ceramic shattering against Italian marble in a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. $800 million? Nearly 7% of our total portfolio, moved without authorization in the middle of the night while I'd been sleeping peacefully, believing that yesterday's revelation had been the end of the drama rather than the beginning. That's impossible, I said, already moving toward my laptop, fingers flying across keys as I accessed our primary security interface. Only 3 people have administrator access to those accounts, and 2 of them are sitting in this conversation. David's pause carried weight, the kind of hesitation that preceded revelations capable of destroying everything you thought you understood about trust and family and the careful architecture of success built over years of methodical planning. Sarah, the access came from Connecticut. The IP address traces to the Blackwood estate. Someone there had credentials that shouldn't exist, and they knew exactly which accounts to target. The implications hit me like a physical blow, air rushing from my lungs as I stared at security logs that told an impossible story. Yesterday, I had walked into my childhood home offering salvation to a family that had rejected me, believing that I controlled every variable, every piece of information, every strategic advantage. Today, I was discovering that someone in that library had been playing a completely different game while I'd been focused on emotional vindication and business negotiations. Pull everything, I said, my voice carrying a steadiness that surprised me. Lock down all offshore accounts, activate emergency protocols, and get our legal team on conference call within the hour. If someone thinks they can steal $800 million from Mitchell Capital and disappear into offshore banking networks that I helped design, they're about to discover exactly how sophisticated our recovery systems actually are. The irony was bitter on my tongue as I dressed with mechanical precision, choosing a black suit that felt more like armor than professional attire. Yesterday, I had lectured my family about the power of offshore investment strategies and international financial networks. Today, I would discover whether those same strategies could be turned against me by people who apparently understood more about my business than I had ever suspected they could.
The drive to Greenwich felt longer than usual, traffic moving with the sluggish indifference of a Tuesday morning, while my mind raced through possibilities and implications, and the growing certainty that yesterday's family reunion had been orchestrated by someone with far more sophisticated understanding of international finance than any of them had revealed. The autumn landscape blurred past my windows, gold and crimson leaves falling like discarded promises, while I tried to piece together how $800 million could vanish from accounts that were supposed to be more secure than Fort Knox. David met me at the estate gates, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something approaching controlled panic. The security footage from the estate shows activity in the library until nearly 3 a.m. Someone was using a laptop with direct access to banking networks that require biometric authentication. Sarah, whoever did this didn't just steal money, they demonstrated detailed knowledge of our entire offshore architecture. We walked up the circular driveway together, past fountain sculptures that seemed to mock yesterday's tentative family reconciliation with their frozen perfection. The Georgian colonial facade looked different in morning light, less like a magazine spread about inherited wealth and more like a crime scene where financial murder had been committed under cover of darkness and family loyalty. Marcus answered the door before we could knock, his face pale and drawn, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. Behind him, the library was visible through the open doorway, and I could see papers scattered across the mahogany table where yesterday we had discussed salvation, and today we would confront theft on an international scale. Sarah, thank God you're here. Something's happened. Something terrible. I studied his expression, searching for signs of deception or guilt, or the careful performance of innocence that people adopted when they'd committed crimes they believed were too sophisticated to be discovered. Instead, I saw genuine confusion and what appeared to be panic that someone else had outmaneuvered him in games he'd never learned to play. "Where's Robert?" I asked, stepping past him into the foyer where my mother's portrait watched over yet another family crisis with painted eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "In the library with Catherine and the lawyers. Sarah, someone broke into our computer system last night. They accessed bank accounts, moved money, left messages on our family email that we can't understand. The police are coming, but we need to know if this affects the acquisition deal." The library looked like a hurricane had swept through it. Papers scattered across every surface, laptops open and glowing, people huddled around screens displaying information that clearly exceeded their ability to comprehend. Robert sat at the head of the table, looking older than his 75 years, while Catherine paced behind him with the manic energy of someone whose carefully controlled world had suddenly become chaotic beyond management. "Sarah, thank God you're here. Something's happened. Something terrible." I studied his expression, searching for signs of deception or guilt, or the careful performance of innocence that people adopted when they'd committed crimes they believed were too sophisticated to be discovered. Instead, I saw genuine confusion and what appeared to be panic that someone else had outmaneuvered him in games he'd never learned to play. "Where's Robert?" I asked, stepping past him into the foyer where my mother's portrait watched over yet another family crisis with painted eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "In the library with Catherine and the lawyers. Sarah, someone broke into our computer system last night. They accessed bank accounts, moved money, left messages on our family email that we can't understand. The police are coming, but we need to know if this affects the acquisition deal." The library looked like a hurricane had swept through it. Papers scattered across every surface, laptops open and glowing, people huddled around screens displaying information that clearly exceeded their ability to comprehend. Robert sat at the head of the table, looking older than his 75 years, while Catherine paced behind him with the manic energy of someone whose carefully controlled world had suddenly become chaotic beyond management. "Sarah, thank God you're here. We've been robbed, but it's not a normal robbery. They took information, accessed accounts we didn't even know existed, and left messages on our family email that we can't understand. The police are coming, but we need to know if this affects the acquisition deal." I approached the table slowly, my eyes scanning the scattered documents and open laptops, trying to understand what had happened in this room after I had left yesterday evening, believing that my family's only sophisticated financial knowledge involved real estate development and traditional banking relationships. "Show me the messages," I said, settling into the chair I had occupied yesterday when revealing my identity seemed like the most dramatic event possible in this library. Marcus handed me a laptop displaying an email that made my blood freeze in my veins. The message was brief, elegant, and demonstrated knowledge of offshore banking procedures that should have been impossible for anyone in this room to possess. Dear Mitchell Capital,
Management, thank you for providing such detailed information about your Cayman Islands portfolios yesterday. The $800 million transfer represents a small down payment on consulting fees owed for financial advice provided over the past 18 months. Additional transfers will follow as our partnership develops. We look forward to continuing our mutually beneficial relationship. Regards, Blackwood International Holdings. The signature line included account numbers that I recognized, transfer authorizations that used my own security protocols, and a closing statement that chilled me to the bone. Blood is thicker than water, but money flows deeper than both. What does this mean? Catherine asked, her voice sharp with panic. What is Blackwood International Holdings? We don't have any international operations. I stared at the screen, pieces of an impossible puzzle slowly arranging themselves into a pattern that defied everything I thought I understood about my family's financial sophistication and business capabilities. Someone in this room had been playing a game far more complex than any of us had realized, using yesterday's emotional family drama as cover for an operation that demonstrated expertise in international finance that rivaled my own. David, I said quietly, run a complete background check on Blackwood International Holdings. I want incorporation documents, banking relationships, board members, and operational history going back 5 years. Someone has been building a shadow operation that mirrors our own business model, and they've been patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. The implications were staggering, reshaping everything I thought I knew about the past 5 years and my family's reaction to my departure. Someone had been watching, learning, and apparently building their own offshore investment empire while allowing me to believe that I was the only Blackwood capable of understanding modern international finance. Robert leaned forward, his face gray with confusion and something that might have been admiration. Sarah, I don't understand any of this. Yesterday, you showed us documents proving that you'd built a $12 billion investment firm. Today, someone steals $800 million using methods that seem to require knowledge we don't possess. How is any of this possible? Before I could answer, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but which displayed a country code that made my heart rate spike. Switzerland. Someone was calling from one of the private banking networks that formed the backbone of Mitchell Capital's offshore operations. Ms. Mitchell, came a voice with a precise European accent. This is Heinrich Weber from Zurich Private Banking. We have received transfer authorizations this morning that appear to be legitimate, but involve amounts that exceed our normal verification protocols. Can you confirm that you have initiated movements of $800 million from your Cayman accounts to a new entity called Blackwood International Holdings? The call was being monitored, recorded, and documented by banking security systems that would create permanent records of every word spoken, which meant that whoever had orchestrated this theft understood not only how to move money through international networks, but also how to ensure that their activities would be officially recorded and legally defensible. Mr. Weber, I did not authorize any transfers to Blackwood International Holdings. This appears to be unauthorized access to Mitchell Capital accounts, and I need you to freeze all associated movements immediately. The pause that followed lasted several seconds, long enough for me to understand that the situation was more complicated than simple theft and more sophisticated than anything my family should have been capable of orchestrating.
Ms. Mitchell, I'm afraid that's not possible. The transfers were authorized using your personal biometric signatures and were accompanied by legal documentation indicating that Blackwood International Holdings is a subsidiary of Mitchell Capital Management. According to our records, you personally established this entity 18 months ago and have been using it for specialized family trust operations. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering against the mahogany table as the implications of Heinrich Weber's words settled over the library like poisonous gas. 18 months ago, biometric signatures, legal documentation that I had never created, but which apparently bore my authorization for activities I had never approved. Someone had been using my identity, my security credentials, and my reputation to build a parallel financial empire that had remained invisible until this moment. Someone who understood international banking well enough to create legally defensible transfers, sophisticated enough to use my own biometric data, and patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. Ms. Mitchell, are you still there? Heinrich Weber's voice emerged from the phone speaker, audible to everyone in the library and carrying information that would reshape our understanding of everything that had happened yesterday and everything that was happening now. I picked up the phone with hands that trembled slightly, my voice steady despite the earthquake taking place in my chest. Mr. Weber, I need you to send me all documentation related to Blackwood International Holdings immediately. Account establishment paperwork, authorization signatures, transfer histories, and any communication records you have from the past 18 months. After ending the call, I looked around the library at faces that reflected varying degrees of confusion, fear, and what might have been carefully concealed guilt. Someone in this room knew more than they were revealing, and the elaborate performance of surprise and victimhood was beginning to feel as sophisticated as the financial crimes that had been committed. We need to discuss some uncomfortable possibilities, I said, my voice carrying the authority that came from 5 years of managing billions in assets and dealing with clients who sometimes had more complex motivations than they initially revealed. Someone with access to this house, this family, and apparently my personal information has been building a financial operation that parallels everything Mitchell Capital has created. They've been patient, sophisticated, and careful enough to use legal channels that make their activities appear legitimate. Catherine stopped pacing, her face going pale as she realized that suspicion was about to fall on everyone in the room. Sarah, you can't possibly think that any of us could understand the kind of financial strategies you've been describing. We're real estate developers, not international criminals. Marcus laughed nervously, a sound that carried too much tension to be entirely innocent. This
Insane. Yesterday, you're offering to save our company. Today, you're accusing us of stealing from yours. Maybe you should consider that your security systems aren't as sophisticated as you thought they were. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a controlled fire, revealing something in Marcus's tone that made me study his expression more carefully. There was knowledge in his eyes, an understanding of international finance that hadn't been there yesterday, or perhaps that had been carefully concealed behind the performance of confused innocence. David Chen leaned forward, his laptop open to security records that painted an increasingly complex picture of the previous night's activities. Sarah, the access logs show that someone was in this library until almost dawn, using a computer with direct connections to banking networks that require specialized software and security clearances. This wasn't random theft. This was planned, sophisticated, and executed by someone with detailed knowledge of how our systems operate. Robert remained quiet, studying documents that had appeared on the table overnight, papers bearing legal seals and authorization signatures that looked disturbingly similar to my own handwriting. His face reflected the growing understanding that yesterday's emotional family reunion had been accompanied by activities that none of us had fully comprehended at the time. "There's something else," David continued, his voice carrying reluctance that preceded revelations capable of destroying whatever trust remained in the room. The Blackwood International Holdings account was established using a Manhattan address that's 3 blocks from Mitchell Capital's offices. Whoever created this entity has been operating in our neighborhood, possibly monitoring our activities for at least 18 months. The pieces of an impossible puzzle were arranging themselves into a pattern that defied rational explanation, while simultaneously explaining everything that had seemed coincidental about yesterday's events. Victoria Sterling's sudden interest in Connecticut real estate, the timing of the acquisition proposal, the sophisticated financial knowledge that someone in my family had apparently been concealing for years. "I have a theory," I said slowly, my eyes moving from face to face as I tested reactions to information that would either confirm suspicions or destroy relationships that had already been damaged beyond repair. Someone in this room has been planning yesterday's confrontation for months, possibly years. They've been building a parallel financial operation that mirrors Mitchell Capital's structure, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves and claim a share of everything I've built. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that preceded either complete honesty or elaborate lies designed to protect secrets that had already been partially exposed. Outside, Connecticut morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating a library where family loyalty was being redefined by financial crimes that demonstrated sophistication none of us had suspected was possible. "The question," I continued, watching carefully for reactions that might reveal guilt or innocence, or the complex motivations that drove people to steal from their own family members, is whether this was opportunistic theft, taking advantage of yesterday's emotional vulnerability, or whether yesterday's entire scene was orchestrated to provide cover for activities that had been planned for much longer than any of us realized. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice carrying something that might have been the beginning of confession or the desperate performance of continued innocence. "Sarah, there's something you need to know about the past 5 years, something that might change how you understand everything that's happened since you left." And in that moment, sitting in the library where my childhood had been shaped by expectations I could never meet, I realized that the most sophisticated theft in Mitchell Capital's history might have been committed by people who understood international finance far better than they had ever revealed, using emotional manipulation and family dynamics to create opportunities that professional criminals could never have engineered. The morning sun climbed higher outside the windows, casting longer shadows across documents that would either restore trust or destroy what remained of the Blackwood family's ability to function as anything more than a collection of people who happened to share genetic material and increasingly complex financial crimes. Whatever Marcus was about to reveal would reshape everything I thought I understood about the past 5 years, my family's reaction to my departure, and the sophisticated operation that had been conducted under cover of traditional Connecticut respectability and wounded family pride. The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove that the most dangerous criminals were often the ones who looked most like victims, and that the most sophisticated financial operations were sometimes hidden behind performances of confusion and innocence that required years of careful planning to execute successfully. Marcus walked to the antique bookshelf that had dominated the library's east wall for as long as I could remember, his fingers tracing the leather spines of volumes that had belonged to our grandfather, great-grandfather, and generations of Blackwoods who had built their fortunes on land development and traditional investments. Behind a first edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he retrieved a slim laptop that looked far more sophisticated than anything I'd seen him use before. "Sarah, meet the real Marcus Blackwood, master's degree in financial engineering from Stanford, specializing in cryptocurrency integration and offshore banking systems. Graduated summa cum laude 3 years ago while you thought I was struggling to manage grandfather's real estate portfolio." The laptop screen illuminated documents that made my carefully constructed understanding of the past 5 years crumble like sandcastles at high tide. Trading records showing cryptocurrency transactions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Banking relationships with institutions in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore that paralleled my own networks. And most shocking of all, detailed surveillance reports on Mitchell Capital Management's operations dating back 4 years. "You've been watching me," I said, the words emerging flat and emotionless despite the hurricane of betrayal spinning through my chest.
For 4 years, you've been monitoring my business operations while pretending to be the incompetent heir who couldn't handle basic financial concepts. Catherine moved to stand beside Marcus, her emerald silk replaced today by charcoal
Business suit that transformed her from decorative stepmother into something far more formidable. Sarah, we've been protecting the family. When you left 5 years ago with all that talk about offshore investments and cryptocurrency, we knew you were onto something revolutionary. We also knew that you were angry enough to use that knowledge against us. She gestured toward the laptop displaying trading records that revealed sophisticated understanding of international markets. So, we decided to learn. Marcus enrolled at Stanford under an assumed name, studied everything you were studying, and built parallel operations that could serve as either partnership opportunities or defensive measures, depending on how your relationship with the family evolved. The revelation hit me like physical violence, reshaping everything I thought I understood about the past 5 years into something far more complex and infinitely more calculating. While I had been building Mitchell Capital Management from nothing, believing myself to be the only Blackwood capable of understanding modern finance, my family had been building shadow operations that mirrored my strategies while maintaining the fiction of traditional real estate incompetence. Blackwood International Holdings, I said slowly, pieces of an impossible puzzle finally arranging themselves into patterns that explained everything and forgave nothing. You've been operating a parallel investment firm for 3 years, using my own strategies, monitoring my client relationships, and positioning yourselves to either partner with me or compete against me depending on circumstances? Robert finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that had been made in secret while I believed myself to be estranged from a family too traditional to understand my vision. Sarah, we never intended for it to become adversarial. The plan was always to reveal Blackwood International when you were ready to come home, to show you that we had learned from our mistakes and were prepared to work together as equals rather than parent and child. Marcus opened another screen showing account balances that made my throat constrict with a combination of admiration and fury. Blackwood International Holdings currently manages $4.7 billion in offshore assets. We've been profitable every quarter for the past 2 years, specializing in cryptocurrency mining operations and international real estate development that integrates digital currencies with traditional property investments. The numbers were staggering, representing the kind of success that should have been impossible for people who had spent years performing ignorance about basic financial concepts. $4.7 billion, managed by a family that had convinced me they couldn't understand cryptocurrency, built through strategies that mirrored my own methodologies while remaining completely invisible to my security systems. Yesterday's acquisition meeting, I said, understanding finally dawning like sunrise after the longest night of my life. Victoria Sterling, the timing, everything. It was all orchestrated to force me to reveal the full scope of Mitchell Capital's operations so you could calculate exactly how much of my business model you still needed to acquire. Catherine nodded with something that might have been pride or might have been apology. Victoria Sterling has been a client of Blackwood International for 18 months. When she expressed interest in Connecticut real estate opportunities, we suggested that she consider acquiring a firm that could provide both local expertise and international investment capabilities. It seemed like perfect timing to finally bring you home. The betrayal was complete, elegant, and demonstrated planning that spanned years of careful observation and patient strategy development. My family hadn't rejected my vision of offshore investment management. They had stolen it, improved upon it, and built their own empire while allowing me to believe that I was operating in isolation from people too traditional to understand modern finance. The $800 million transfer, David Chen said quietly, his voice carrying the professional calm that came from years of dealing with sophisticated financial crimes. That wasn't theft. That was a withdrawal from jointly managed accounts that you didn't know existed. Marcus smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since I'd known him as an adult. Sarah, you've been managing money for Blackwood International Holdings for 2 years without realizing it. Some of your most profitable clients were actually shell corporations we created to funnel family assets through Mitchell Capital systems. We've been business partners longer than you think.
The laptop screen displayed client records that I recognized, accounts that had generated millions in management fees for Mitchell Capital, while apparently representing investments from the family that had supposedly rejected everything I stood for. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope, sophisticated in its execution, and personally devastating in ways that simple theft could never have achieved. Pemberton Holdings, Stratford Investments, Fairfield Asset Management, I read from the client list, my voice growing smaller with each name as I recognized accounts that had been among my most lucrative relationships. These were all Blackwood family assets disguised as independent clients. Catherine opened her own laptop, revealing financial projections that painted a picture of coordinated family wealth management that dwarfed anything I had imagined possible. Sarah, when Mitchell Capital and Blackwood International Holdings combine operations, will control over $17 billion in offshore assets, will be one of the largest private wealth management firms in the world, specializing in integration strategies that no other company has successfully developed. The future they were describing was everything I had dreamed of building, scaled beyond my wildest ambitions, and backed by family resources that transformed Mitchell Capital from successful boutique firm into global financial powerhouse. It was also built on years of deception, manipulation, and the systematic theft of strategies I had developed while believing myself to be operating in isolation from people too traditional to understand modern finance. The $800 million transfer, David Chen said quietly, his voice carrying the professional calm that came from years of dealing with sophisticated financial crimes. That wasn't theft. That was a withdrawal from jointly managed accounts that you didn't know existed. Marcus smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since I'd known him as an adult. Sarah, you've been managing money for Blackwood International Holdings for 2 years without realizing it. Some of your most profitable clients were actually shell corporations we created to funnel family assets through Mitchell Capital systems. We've been business partners longer than you think.
Approaches that made Mitchell Capital revolutionary. The rejection forced you to become better, more creative, more resilient than you would have been with our support. The psychology was as sophisticated as the financial engineering, designed to create optimal conditions for innovation while ensuring that the family ultimately benefited from whatever success emerged from my exile and determination to prove them wrong. They had manipulated me into becoming the person they needed me to be while allowing me to believe that I was rejecting everything they represented. The acquisition offer, I said, understanding finally arriving like a physical weight settling on my shoulders. Sterling Financial Group isn't acquiring Blackwood Holdings. You're proposing a merger between Mitchell Capital and Blackwood International, with Victoria Sterling serving as the front for operations that you've been planning for years. Marcus nodded, his expression carrying something that might have been respect for my ability to finally see the complete picture. Sarah, you built something extraordinary from nothing. We built something extraordinary from watching you. Together, we can build something that neither of us could achieve independently. The question is whether you can forgive the methodology long enough to appreciate the results. The morning sun had climbed high enough to flood the library with golden light that illuminated documents and laptops and family members who had just revealed themselves to be far more sophisticated than any of us had ever acknowledged. The room felt different now, charged with possibilities that extended far beyond simple business partnerships into territory that redefined what family loyalty could mean when filtered through billions of dollars in international financial strategies. $17 billion, David Chen repeated, his voice carrying the kind of awe that came from understanding what those numbers represented in terms of global financial influence. Sarah, they're not proposing a hostile takeover. They're proposing to make you one of the most powerful people in international wealth management. Catherine moved to the window, looking out over the Connecticut landscape that had shaped our childhood understanding of success and limitation. The choice is yours, Sarah. You can walk away from this, take Mitchell Capital independent, and continue building something impressive but ultimately constrained by the resources of a single person. Or you can embrace the reality that family loyalty sometimes requires methods that look like betrayal, but produce results that serve everyone's interests.
The decision hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that would reshape not only my business operations, but my understanding of trust, family, and the complex motivations that drove people to elaborate deceptions in service of goals that might ultimately be beneficial to everyone involved. Marcus closed his laptop and extended his hand across the mahogany table that had witnessed so many family arguments and disappointments. Sarah, I'm offering you a partnership that combines your innovation with our resources, your independence with our family loyalty, and your vision with our patience. Blackwood International Holdings wants to merge with Mitchell Capital Management as equals, not as acquisition target and predator. I stared at his outstretched hand, calculating risks and benefits and the likelihood that people who had demonstrated such sophisticated capacity for deception could be trusted to honor any agreement we might reach. The past 5 years of isolation and determination had been built on the assumption that my family lacked both the vision and the capability to understand what I was trying to build. Today I was discovering that they had understood perfectly, had built their own version of my vision, and had been waiting for the right moment to reveal that separation had always been temporary strategy rather than permanent estrangement. If I agree to this merger, I said slowly, my eyes moving from Marcus to Catherine to Robert as I searched for signs of continued deception or genuine desire for partnership. I want complete transparency about Blackwood International's operations, client relationships, and strategic objectives. No more shell corporations, no more monitoring of Mitchell Capital without my knowledge, and no more elaborate performances designed to manipulate my decision-making process. Robert nodded immediately, his relief evident as he realized that negotiation meant acceptance was possible. Full transparency, equal partnership, and shared decision-making authority over all strategic directions. Sarah, we spent 5 years learning that we needed you to be successful before we could work together successfully. We're not interested in controlling what you've built. We want to contribute to making it bigger than any of us could achieve independently. David Chen opened his own laptop, displaying merger documents that had clearly been prepared weeks in advance, legal frameworks that transformed family reconciliation into business partnership, with protections and guarantees that addressed every concern I could have raised about working with people who had demonstrated such sophisticated capacity for deception. The legal structure preserves Mitchell Capital's operational independence while providing access to Blackwood International's resources and client networks, he explained, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who understood that this decision would define the rest of my professional and personal life. You maintain control over innovation and strategy development while gaining family support and financial backing that eliminates competitive pressures and allows for long-term planning that most firms can't achieve. Catherine returned to the table, her expression softened by something that might have been genuine affection mixed with respect for what I had built despite their elaborate interference. Sarah, we're not asking you to forgive the methodology. We're asking you to consider whether the results justify the complexity of how we got here. You wanted to prove that offshore investment strategies could revolutionize wealth management. We gave you the isolation and motivation necessary to develop those strategies beyond what you would have achieved with our support from the beginning. The truth was simultaneously flattering and insulting, acknowledging my capabilities while revealing that those capabilities had been cultivated through manipulation rather than genuine independence. I had succeeded despite their rejection, but their rejection had been calculated to produce exactly the kind of success that would ultimately serve their interests as well as my own. 24 hours, I said finally. Standing and gathering the scattered documents
Had transformed my understanding of the past 5 years and the future possibilities that extended beyond anything I had imagined when walking into this library yesterday morning. I need 24 hours to review everything with my own legal team, to verify the claims about Blackwood International's operations, and to decide whether family partnership is worth the risks that come with trusting people who have demonstrated such sophisticated capacity for beneficial deception. Marcus smiled, the expression carrying genuine warmth that had been absent from our relationship since childhood. Sarah, take all the time you need. Blackwood International Holdings has been patient for 3 years. We can be patient for 1 more day. The offer stands. The merger documents are legally binding, and the opportunity to build something extraordinary together isn't going anywhere. As I walked toward the library door, carrying portfolios and laptops and the weight of decisions that would reshape everything I thought I knew about success and family and the complex intersections between them,
Robert's voice stopped me at the threshold. Sarah, your mother would be proud of what you've built. She would also be proud that we finally learned to appreciate the daughter she always knew you could become. The words followed me out into the Connecticut morning, where autumn light filtered through trees that had witnessed generations of Blackwood family decisions and would continue standing long after today's revelations had been transformed into tomorrow's business partnerships or permanent estrangements. The drive back to Manhattan felt shorter than usual, traffic flowing with unusual efficiency while my mind processed implications that extended far beyond simple business mergers into territory that redefined what family loyalty could mean when filtered through billions of dollars and the sophisticated financial strategies that I had developed during 5 years of believing myself to be completely independent. By evening, I had reviewed every document, verified every claim about Blackwood International Holdings, and confirmed that my family had indeed built a parallel financial empire that rivaled my own achievements while remaining completely invisible to security systems I had believed were comprehensive and impenetrable. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like choice than like recognition of a reality that had always existed beneath the surface of family relationships I had never fully understood. Tomorrow, I would return to the Blackwood estate, not as the prodigal daughter seeking reconciliation or the successful entrepreneur offering salvation, but as an equal partner in a family business that had always been more sophisticated than any of us had been willing to acknowledge. The merger documents were signed in the same library where my mother's portrait watched over yet another transformation of the Blackwood family legacy, this time expanding it beyond Connecticut real estate development into international financial territories that previous generations could never have imagined. $17 billion in combined assets, global reach that spanned 14 countries, and partnership agreements that transformed family loyalty from emotional obligation into profitable collaboration. 6 months later, Mitchell Capital Blackwood International ranked among the top 5 private wealth management firms in the world, specializing in cryptocurrency integration and offshore investment strategies that had become industry standards rather than innovative experiments. The girl who had left Greenwich believing herself rejected by people too traditional to understand her vision had returned as co-founder of a financial empire that exceeded her wildest ambitions, while teaching her that family relationships could be more complex, more strategic, and ultimately more supportive than she had ever imagined possible. The sailing ship paperweight sat on my new desk in the merged company's Manhattan headquarters, still catching light and seeming to move on invisible waves, but now surrounded by family photographs that included faces I had learned to trust again, and partnership agreements that proved blood could indeed be thicker than water when properly managed through sophisticated offshore banking systems and shared commitment to building something bigger than any individual could achieve alone. 2 years had passed since the merger transformed Mitchell Capital Blackwood International into one of the world's most influential private wealth management firms, and I stood in my corner office watching Manhattan's skyline shimmer in the late afternoon sun, a view that now stretched across 3 floors of the most prestigious financial district address money could secure. The sailing ship paperweight caught the light from its position on my mahogany desk, surrounded by documents that represented deals worth more than some countries' annual budgets, and family photographs that had been impossible to imagine during those lonely years when I believed myself exiled from people too traditional to understand my vision. The intercom buzzed with news that would have seemed impossible during my years of exile, yet had become routine in the months since our family's financial empire had expanded beyond even my most ambitious projections. Sarah, the Prime Minister of Singapore is holding on line 2, and the Governor of the Bank of England wants to schedule a private consultation about cryptocurrency integration policies. Also, your father called to remind you about tonight's family dinner celebrating the completion of the Dubai investment complex. I smiled at the casual mention of conversations with world leaders who sought our expertise on financial strategies that had once been dismissed as criminal fantasies by people who now partner with me in building something that exceeded all our individual capabilities. The irony remained delicious, even 2 years later. though it had been tempered by genuine respect and affection that had grown from working together as equals rather than parent and disappointing child. The Dubai project represented everything Mitchell Capital Blackwood International had become since combining my innovation with my family's resources and patience. $47 billion in cryptocurrency-backed real estate development that integrated offshore banking networks with traditional property investment in ways that created new categories of international wealth management. The complex would house the regional headquarters of 12 major financial institutions, residential towers for ultra-high net worth individuals seeking tax optimization strategies, and commercial spaces designed specifically for companies operating across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. Marcus appeared in my doorway, carrying tablets displaying
time trading data from markets that never slept, his transformation from underachieving heir to sophisticated international financier complete in ways that still occasionally surprised me, despite 2 years of daily collaboration. The Hong Kong cryptocurrency exchange just confirmed our latest mining operation purchase, he said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk with the easy confidence of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be less capable than he actually was. We'll control approximately 8% of global Bitcoin mining by the end of next quarter, which should generate passive income of roughly $12 million per month. The numbers had become almost abstract in their magnitude, representing wealth accumulation on scales that transformed individual success into something approaching geopolitical influence. Mitchell Capital Blackwood International now managed assets worth more than the GDP of most developed nations, employed over 2,000 people across 19 countries, and maintained banking relationships that made us partners rather than clients of institutions that had once seemed impossibly prestigious and exclusive. Catherine wants to discuss the European expansion plans during dinner, Marcus continued, his relationship with his mother transformed by business success into something more professional and infinitely more respectful than the performative family dynamics that had characterized our childhood. The Luxembourg holding company structure is ready for implementation, and we've secured regulatory approval for cryptocurrency trading operations in 7 additional EU jurisdictions. I nodded, my attention divided between Marcus's briefing and the satisfaction of watching my personal assistant field calls from government officials who wanted our advice on policies that would affect global financial markets. The girl who had been excluded from family communications for 5 years now received more international phone calls in a single afternoon than most people encounter in their entire careers, consulting on strategies that influenced how entire nations approach taxation, digital currencies, and offshore investment regulations. "How's Robert handling the transition to advisory status?" I asked, referring to my father's gradual shift from active management to elder statesman role as his 77 years began requiring more delegation of day-to-day operational responsibilities. The change had been voluntary and graceful, motivated by genuine recognition that the financial empire we had built required expertise that transcended traditional generational leadership models. Marcus's smile carried warmth that would have been impossible during the years when he believed protecting his inheritance required minimizing my influence on family decisions. "He's loving it, actually. Yesterday, he spent 3 hours explaining offshore tax optimization strategies to a senator's finance committee, using terminology he learned from you, but presenting it with the authority that comes from 7 decades of business experience. The combination is incredibly effective." The transformation of family relationships through shared professional success had been one of the most unexpected benefits of the merger, creating dynamics that none of us could have predicted when emotional reconciliation seemed impossible and business partnership appeared unlikely. Working together as equals had revealed capabilities and personalities that had been obscured by traditional parent-child hierarchies and competitive sibling dynamics that no longer served anyone's interests. My phone rang with a call from Victoria Sterling, whose investment firm had become our most frequent collaborator on deals that required coordination between multiple international jurisdictions and regulatory frameworks. "Sarah, congratulations on the Singapore approval. The Minister of Finance personally called to thank me for recommending Mitchell Capital Blackwood International for their Sovereign Wealth Fund restructuring project. You've just been awarded exclusive management rights for $43 billion in government assets."
The Singapore contract represented validation that extended beyond financial success into recognition by world leaders that our family's combined expertise had created something genuinely revolutionary in international wealth management. Sovereign wealth funds represented the most sophisticated and demanding clients in global finance, and their willingness to entrust billions to our management confirmed that we had achieved the kind of reputation that took decades to build and could be destroyed by a single mistake or ethical compromise. Victoria, what's the timeline for implementation? I asked, already calculating the staffing requirements and infrastructure expansion that would be necessary to manage government assets that came with security considerations and transparency requirements that exceeded even our most demanding private clients. 6 months for full implementation, but they want Mitchell Capital Blackwood International to begin advisory services immediately. Sarah, this isn't just another client relationship. This is Singapore positioning itself as the first nation to fully integrate cryptocurrency reserves with traditional sovereign wealth management. You're literally helping to design the future of how countries think about their financial assets. The implications extended far beyond simple business expansion into territory that would establish our family firm as pioneers in governmental financial strategy, advisors to nations rather than merely managers of individual wealth. The girl who had been told her offshore investment strategies were criminal fantasies was now being asked by governments to help them implement those same strategies as official national policy. After ending the call with Victoria, I stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that provided panoramic views of Manhattan's financial district, where other firms struggled to adapt to market changes that we had anticipated years in advance through strategies that combined my innovation with my family's resources and patient planning. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across streets where billions of dollars changed hands daily. But from my perspective, 53 floors above the chaos, the movement looked almost peaceful, like watching waves from a lighthouse that guided rather than fought the currents. Marcus joined me at the window, both of us contemplating the view that represented not just personal success, but transformation of our understanding about what family loyalty could mean when expressed through sophisticated business partnership rather than traditional emotional obligations. Sarah, do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't orchestrated that confrontation 2 years ago? If we had simply approached you directly about merging?
Operations instead of creating the elaborate performance that forced you to reveal everything about Mitchell Capital? The question had occurred to me many times during the past 2 years, particularly during moments when I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we had built together and curious about alternative paths that might have led to different outcomes. I think we would have failed, I said honestly, watching afternoon light transform glass and steel into something almost artistic. If you had approached me directly, I would have been suspicious of your motivations and protective of Mitchell Capital's independence. The confrontation forced both sides to reveal capabilities and intentions that we had been concealing from each other for years. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his reflection in the window showing someone who had grown from uncertain heir into confident international financier through experiences that had challenged every assumption about his capabilities and ambitions. The deception was necessary because the trust had to be earned rather than assumed. We needed to prove that we could operate at your level before proposing partnership, and you needed to see that we had evolved beyond the traditional thinking that drove you away originally. The psychology remained fascinating even 2 years later, demonstrating how family relationships could be transformed through business success in ways that purely emotional reconciliation might never have achieved. Working together as equals had created mutual respect that transcended childhood dynamics and traditional generational hierarchies, replacing resentment and misunderstanding with appreciation for complementary skills and shared commitment to building something bigger than any individual could manage alone. Tonight's dinner should be interesting, Marcus continued, referring to the monthly family gatherings that had become both celebration and strategic planning session as our business empire continued expanding into territories that required coordination between personal relationships and professional responsibilities. Catherine has been working on the African expansion proposal, and Robert wants to discuss establishing a family foundation that would use our offshore expertise to optimize charitable giving on unprecedented scales.
The evolution of family dinners from awkward social obligations into high-level business strategy meetings reflected broader changes in how we understood the intersection between personal loyalty and professional collaboration. These gatherings now included spouses who had become integral to our operations, children who were being educated in international finance from elementary school age, and occasionally government officials or business partners whose presence transformed family meals into informal diplomatic events. As evening approached and Manhattan's skyline began glittering with lights that represented countless individual ambitions and dreams, I prepared to leave the office that had become both sanctuary and command center for operations that influenced global financial markets and governmental policies across multiple continents. The girl who had been excluded from family communications now participated in conversations that affected how nations approached taxation, digital currencies, and international investment strategies. The drive to Greenwich had become routine, though the Connecticut landscape still carried memories of the years when this journey represented exile and rejection rather than family partnership and shared success. The trees along the Merritt Parkway were beginning their autumn transformation, gold and crimson leaves that reminded me of cycles that brought both endings and beginnings, death and renewal, separation and eventual reunion under circumstances that none of us could have predicted or planned. The Blackwood estate looked different now, enhanced by security systems that reflected our family's elevated profile in international finance, and modified by additions that accommodated frequent visits from government officials and business partners who required privacy and protection that exceeded normal residential standards. The circular driveway was lined with vehicles that included armored sedans for visiting dignitaries and the kind of sophisticated communication equipment that allowed our home to function as backup headquarters for operations that never completely stopped. Robert met me at the front door, looking healthier and more energetic than he had in years, his retirement from day-to-day management having freed him to focus on the advisory and relationship-building activities that utilized his decades of experience while allowing younger family members to handle operational complexities that required more technical expertise. Sarah? Perfect timing. The Prime Minister of Luxembourg just finished a video call about the cryptocurrency banking regulations we proposed last month. They're implementing our recommendations as official national policy. The casual mention of conversations with world leaders had become normal in our household, though I still occasionally marveled at how completely our family's influence had expanded beyond Connecticut real estate development into territories that affected international monetary policy and governmental financial strategy. The dining room had been modified with communication equipment that allowed family dinners to accommodate secure calls from clients and partners operating across multiple time zones simultaneously. Catherine appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron over designer clothing that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Her transformation from decorative stepmother into sophisticated international businesswoman, complete in ways that demonstrated capabilities she had kept hidden during the years when family dynamics required different performances from everyone involved. Sarah, Marcus briefed me on the Singapore contract. Congratulations on landing another government client. We're going to need to hire at least 50 additional analysts to handle the workload expansion. The staffing requirements reflected broader growth that had transformed Mitchell Capital Blackwood International from boutique family firm into global financial institution that competed with companies that have been established for centuries and employed tens of thousands of people across multiple continents. Our success had created responsibilities that extended far beyond personal wealth accumulation into obligations to employees, clients, and governments that depended on our expertise for financial strategies that affected millions of people indirectly. Marcus arrived carrying his laptop and tablets displaying real-time market data from exchanges that operated around the clock.
Dedication to monitoring global financial movements having become both professional necessity and personal obsession that drove him to maintain awareness of opportunities and risks that could affect our clients' portfolios across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. The cryptocurrency markets are responding positively to news about our government contracts, he reported, settling into his chair at the dining table that had witnessed so many family arguments and now served as an informal boardroom for discussions that influenced international financial policy. Robert poured wine from bottles that had been selected by consultants who specialized in pairings that impressed government officials and business partners whose cultural backgrounds required understanding of traditions and preferences that extended far beyond simple taste considerations. "I received an interesting call today from the Secretary of the Treasury," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to see his family's influence expand beyond his wildest dreams. "They want Mitchell Capital Blackwood International to advise on cryptocurrency integration policies that could affect how the United States approaches digital currency regulation." The conversation that followed covered territories that would have been unimaginable during the years when our family struggled to understand each other's motivations and capabilities. Discussing strategies that influenced how nations approached financial policy, while sharing dessert and reminiscing about childhood memories that had shaped our understanding of success and loyalty and the complex intersections between personal relationships and professional achievements. "The African expansion proposal is ready for implementation," Catherine announced, opening her own laptop to display maps and financial projections that represented 18 months of research and relationship building across 12 countries that offered opportunities for cryptocurrency mining operations and offshore investment strategies that could benefit from stable political environments and favorable regulatory frameworks. "We've secured partnerships with 3 governments and established relationships with mining consortiums that could generate passive income exceeding $20 million per month within 2 years." The scale of growth had begun requiring strategic decisions about geographic expansion and resource allocation that tested our family's ability to maintain cohesion while managing operations that spanned multiple continents and involved relationships with hundreds of government officials, business partners, and regulatory authorities whose cooperation was essential for continued success. As the evening progressed and our discussion moved from business strategy to personal reflections about the journey that had brought us from estrangement to partnership, I found myself thinking about the girl who had walked out of this house 5 years ago, believing herself rejected by people too traditional to understand her vision. The woman sitting at this table had learned that family relationships could be more complex, more strategic, and ultimately more supportive than she had ever imagined possible when filtered through shared commitment to building something bigger than any individual could achieve alone. "I have an announcement," Robert said as we finished dessert, his voice carrying the formality that preceded major family decisions. "I've been talking with estate attorneys about succession planning that reflects the reality of what Mitchell Capital Blackwood International has become. Sarah, I'm transferring my controlling interests to you, effective immediately. This family's financial future belongs with the person who had the vision to create it and the capability to manage it responsibly." The transfer represented more than simple business succession, acknowledging that leadership should be based on competence rather than traditional generational hierarchies, and recognizing that the empire we had built together required ongoing innovation and adaptation that utilized everyone's strengths while positioning the family for continued growth across multiple decades. As the evening concluded and we prepared for another day of managing assets worth more than some countries' annual budgets, consulting with government officials about policies that would affect millions of people, and building financial strategies that pushed the boundaries of what individual families could achieve through sophisticated international coordination, I reflected on the unexpected ways that rejection and reconciliation had combined to create opportunities that none of us could have imagined when emotional wounds seemed insurmountable. The sailing ship paperweight sat on my desk back in Manhattan the next morning, still catching light and seeming to move on invisible waves, but now surrounded by documents that represented partnerships with governments, relationships with world leaders, and financial strategies that had transformed my mother's advice about charting my own course into navigation systems that helped entire nations find their way through the complexities of modern international finance. The girl who had been called broke at a family estate meeting had returned 2 years later as co-founder of one of the world's most influential financial institutions,
proving that sometimes the most sophisticated revenge was simply succeeding beyond everyone's capacity to imagine or deny, while building bridges that transformed family loyalty from emotional obligation into profitable collaboration that served everyone's interests while exceeding everyone's individual capabilities. 5 years later, I stood on the balcony of our new London headquarters, watching the Thames flow beneath Tower Bridge while my phone buzzed with congratulations from finance ministers across 3 continents. The Financial Times had just announced that Mitchell Capital Blackwood International had been selected to manage the world's first multinational cryptocurrency reserve fund, a $37 billion consortium representing the combined digital assets of 12 developed nations seeking to modernize their monetary policies through strategies we had pioneered. The irony wasn't lost on me as I read messages from the same governments that once viewed cryptocurrency as dangerous speculation, now requesting our expertise to implement national policies based on offshore investment strategies my family had once dismissed as criminal fantasies. The girl who had been excluded from estate meetings was now invited to economic summits where her recommendations influenced how entire regions approached financial modernization. Marcus appeared beside me, carrying champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had helped build something that exceeded everyone's initial vision. The Japanese central bank has announced that they want to make Mitchell Capital Blackwood International official advisor on national cryptocurrency regulation, he reported, watching me open the champagne with more confidence than I had the last time we stood on a balcony with waves below us. Was it even possible for people like us to influence major world politics and financial strategies without becoming corrupted ourselves?
Just confirmed their participation in the consortium. We're officially managing monetary policy for half the world's developed economies. His transformation from pretending incompetence to genuine expertise remained one of my favorite aspects of our family's evolution. Proof that people could grow beyond the limitations of their original roles when given proper incentives and opportunities. Inside our London offices, Catherine was conducting a video conference with African development ministers about infrastructure projects that would integrate cryptocurrency mining with rural electrification programs, demonstrating how our family's financial expertise could address humanitarian challenges while generating sustainable profits for all participants. Her evolution from decorative stepmother to international development strategist represented the kind of personal growth that became possible when family dynamics were rebuilt around shared professional goals rather than traditional hierarchical expectations. Robert had called earlier from his retirement in Greenwich, his voice carrying pride that had replaced the confusion and resistance that once characterized his response to my ambitions. "Sarah, your grandfather would be amazed to see what the Blackwood name represents now. We've gone from Connecticut real estate developers to advisors who help nations design their financial futures. The family legacy has evolved beyond anything previous generations could have imagined." The London skyline stretched endlessly in both directions, a panorama of ancient architecture and modern finance that reflected the intersection of traditional wealth and innovative strategies that defined our approach to international business. Our offices occupied 4 floors of the most prestigious address in the financial district, employing over 800 professionals whose expertise spanned every aspect of global monetary policy and digital asset management. As evening approached and the Thames reflected lights from buildings that house the world's most influential financial institutions, I thought about the journey that had brought us from family estrangement to global leadership and strategies that governments sought and competitors struggled to understand. The sailing ship paperweight sat on my London desk now, still catching light and appearing to navigate invisible currents, surrounded by documents that represented partnerships with central banks and development funds that trusted our family's expertise to guide their transition into the digital economy of the future. The phone rang with a call from Singapore's Prime Minister, requesting consultation on implementing cryptocurrency integration policies across Southeast Asian markets, followed immediately by messages from Switzerland about expanding our mining operations into renewable energy partnerships that would make environmental sustainability profitable rather than costly. These conversations had become routine.
though they still occasionally reminded me of the distance we had traveled from the family that once believed offshore investments were too risky and unconventional to pursue seriously. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as Mitchell Capital, Blackwood International, continued expanding into territories that pushed the boundaries of what private firms could achieve through sophisticated international coordination and government partnerships. But tonight, standing on this balcony overlooking the Thames, while champagne bubbled in crystal glasses and family members celebrated another milestone in our ongoing transformation of global financial architecture, I felt grateful for the rejection that had forced me to become someone capable of building bridges between traditional thinking and innovative possibilities. The girl who had been called broke at an estate meeting had become the woman who helped nations optimize their wealth through strategies that transformed digital currencies from speculative investments into foundational elements of modern monetary policy. Sometimes, the greatest revenge was simply succeeding so completely that your former critics became your most enthusiastic partners, eager to learn from expertise they had once dismissed, but now desperately needed to remain relevant in a world that had evolved beyond their original understanding. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.